This is called Language as Wound Technology on vocalization, impressive speech, and the recovery of the true word. Only what is true can be understood. This is not a philosophical position to be argued. It is a structural observation about the nature of meaning itself. The proposition that 2 plus 2 equals 17 can be uttered. It can be written, amplified, enforced by institutional authority, but it cannot be understood, not because it is complex, but because it is false. It has nowhere to land. It cannot be integrated, solved, or received. It does not belong to the field of what is. This is the fulcrum. Between speech that is true and speech that is false, there is not merely a difference of content, but a difference of nature. True speech participates in what is. False speech attempts to substitute for what is, to override it, to impose an alternative reality onto the field. The question this essay asks is, how did human language, which began, like all animal vocalization, in the direct and honest expression of what was alive or in pain, become the primary technology for this substitution? How did the word, which was first a gesture of life toward life, become the instrument by which the wound perpetuates itself most durably? The answer runs through 4 movements. The first is descent. From pure vocalization through expressive speech into the fully elaborated noun grammar of impressive speech, each step representing greater localization and greater capacity for separation and enforcement. The second is the induction, how trauma installs the ego system, and how the ego system generates the noun, and from the noun, ownership, and from ownership, violence, as its necessary and structural output. The third is the legibility trap, how the ego system converts the intelligible field of genuine encounter into a legible record of managed categories, and what was lost in that translation. The fourth is the turn, because even at the furthest reach of the descent, at the level of the written law, the algorithm, the world-making sentence of the judge, what is speaking is still at its most buried layer a please. The purpose of this essay is to give back that hearing. The descent from vocalization to the noun. Many creatures on earth vocalize. Sound making is rich and complex throughout the natural world. The crow, the whale, the vervet monkey, the nightingale, each produces a repertoire of calls whose functions are as various as alarm, courtship, territorial assertion, social bonding, and what researchers who study birdsong increasingly describe as something approaching pure function lust. The joy of exercising a capacity beyond any instrumental purpose. This last observation matters. The nightingale that sings for hours into the darkness beyond any territorial necessity is, in Marshall Rosenberg's terms, giving a thank you. A creature in whom the is ground is sufficiently operative that it overflows into sound, not to produce an effect, but because the aliveness is too full to be silent. Against this, or rather continuous with it at the other pole, is the distress call, the animal in pain, in threat, in isolation, or helplessness. This is the please in its most naked form. The youngster who's fallen out of the tree and emits diminutive cries to locate itself. The infant mammal separated from his mother. Pure vocalization at this register is incapable of deception. It is the organism's state announcing itself directly to the field, with no mediation between condition and expression. Between these two poles, the overflowing thank you of the nightingale and the bare please of the distress call lies the full spectrum of animal vocal communication. And within this spectrum, a distinction begins to clarify, the distinction between expression and impression. Expressive speech, even in its most elaborate human form, is speech that proceeds from a state and offers itself to the field. It does not require a specific response. It does not attempt to produce a predetermined effect. It asks, at most, to be witnessed, to be received by a consciousness that can genuinely meet what is being offered. The poem that works is not the one that tries hardest to impress. It is the one in which the speaker was most genuinely surprised by what they found, and the surprise is still alive in the language. Impressive speech is different in kind. It is speech directed at rather than toward. It is organized not around what is alive in the speaker, but around what effect it needs to produce in the listener. It leverages, presses, sells, enforces. Its measure of success is not truth, but efficacy. Not did this express something real, but did this produce the intended result? And crucially, it does not require genuine encounter. It requires submission. John Searle cataloged 5 fundamental speech act types: assertives, directives, commissives, expressives, and declaratives. J.L. Austin distinguished locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary dimensions of every utterance. These taxonomies are precise and useful, but Marshall Rosenberg's reduction runs even deeper than any taxonomy. What he observes is not a competing classification, but the motivational substrate beneath every category. That every utterance, however elaborated, whether it asserts, directs, commits, expresses, or declares, is generated by either abundance or deficiency of need. Either the organism is overflowing and the speech is its thank you, or the organism is in want and the speech is its please. The taxonomy describes the form. Rosenberg names the ground. What this reduction reveals when you look from this ground is the directionality of the descent from the expressive please and thank you of pure vocalization, true, immediate, incapable of deception, downward through the increasingly mediated, increasingly nounified, increasingly impressive forms until you arrive at the world-making sentence in which the please has been so completely armored in institutional authority that it no longer sounds like a please at all. The induction, trauma, the noun, and the sequence of violence. The noun is the ego system's primary cognitive instrument. To understand why requires understanding both what the ego system is and what Krishnamurti means when he defines violence as the imposition of what should be onto what is. The ego system is a trauma response, the organism's adaptive reorganization in the face of conditions that interrupt the we ground, threat, helplessness, isolation, pain that cannot be metabolized. Internal family systems makes this visible with precision. Trauma reliably parts the psyche. The self that could not tolerate the pain or threat does not disappear, it departs. Something leaves. And in that vacuum, the inexhaustible fills in. Fabricated selves, protective sub-personalities organized around the original wound, each operating as if the wound were still present and still requiring management. The placeholder operates. Recovery, when it comes, is recovery into the fabricated self, not into stage 0. Dissociation is this departure made permanent. the ego multiplied within a single psychic system, each fragment managing a different face of the original unbearable condition. Now, what does this fragmented, managing, safety-oriented organism do with language? It requires the environment to be legible. Legibility is safety when you cannot trust the field directly. If I can name the thing, categorize it, predict its behavior, manage my response from the category, if I can see the chair rather than having to freshly encounter whatever is actually present, I survive at lower metabolic cost. The noun makes this possible. The noun freezes the verb. It arrests the becoming, names the being, and then treats the name as if it were the thing. And here, Krishnamurti's definition becomes structurally precise. The noun is violence in this sense. The noun performs, at the level of grammar, exactly the gesture Krishnamurti names. It imposes the what should be, the category, the known, the stable and bounded thing onto what is, the process, the event, the verb, the becoming. Chair imposes thingness onto what is, in its factual nature, a temporary organization of matter in a particular relationship with gravity in the surrounding field. The noun is not merely a convenience, it is a claim, and a false one. It says, the category is more real than the encounter. It substitutes the known for the new. This substitution is the violence prior to any physical enactment. Ownership follows with the same necessity. You cannot own a verb. Ownership requires a noun first. The river cannot be owned while it is received as rivering. It must first be converted into the river, a bounded, stable, nameable thing, before the claim of possession becomes even grammatically coherent. Ownership is the ecosystem's spatial extension of the noun. Having first frozen the process into a thing, it then assigns the thing to an I. The imposition compounds. What is becomes a thing, and then the thing becomes mine. Physical violence, in the full bodily sense, is what happens when the owned thing refuses to stay nounified, when what is insists on its own nature against the claim. The sequence is therefore not accidental, but structural. What is turns to the noun, imposition of stable identity onto living process, turns to ownership, imposition of mind onto the stabilized thing, turns to law, ownership made permanent in writing, turns to force, ownership defending itself against what is when it refuses to yield. Each step is the same gesture at greater intensity. The noun is latent violence. Ownership is the noun armed. Written law is ownership made permanent. Physical force is what should be at maximum insistence. And the wound is present at every level, not as malice, but as the ecosystem doing exactly what it was built to do, managing from the known, keeping the organism safe from having to be genuinely changed by what it meets. Notice also what the wound does to the speaker in the act of impressive speech. The wound is bilateral. To press your words onto another, to enforce rather than express, is to close yourself off from the only thing that could actually satisfy what the pressing is for. The ecosystem's pleas, delivered from impressive speech, cannot be received by the very mechanism that delivers it. The demand for acknowledgement cannot produce genuine acknowledgement. The leveraged belonging cannot produce genuine belonging. The impressive speaker is, at the moment of pressing, most completely alone, most fully in the ecosystem, most cut off from the is level, most armored against the we ground that alone could meet what the pressing cannot reach. The legibility trap on legible and intelligible. Here is a distinction that the wound conceals and that the etymology recovers, the difference between legible and intelligible. Both words root in the same ground. Leg, meaning to gather, to pick out, to collect. From this root comes an entire family, legere, to read, to gather, legalis, of the law, legitimate, lecture, legend, legion, elect, select, collect, logic, logos. And crucially, intelligence from inter plus legere, meaning to pick out between, to read between the lines, to gather what is present in the encounter rather than what the record already holds. Legible means capable of being read from the noun surface. The category holds. The record can be consulted. The known meets the new and recognizes it as something already filed. Legible is the ego system's epistemic achievement. The environment successfully converted into a system of stable, manageable names. Intelligible means something different in kind, capable of being understood through genuine inter-reading, through the willingness to remain in the between, in the two-level encounter long enough for what is actually present to surface. Intelligibility does not require the noun to hold. It requires the encounter to be genuine. The ecosystem seeks legibility. It seeks the noun to stay fixed, the category to be reliable, the environment to be manageable from the record. What it cannot do, structurally, not as a moral failure, is interlegere, to read between. It cannot stay in the encounter long enough for the new to arrive because the new is precisely what the ecosystem was built to prevent. The known meeting the new and being changed by it is the ecosystem's definition of danger. The hero system seeks intelligibility. It reads between. It picks out what is actually present in the encounter rather than what the category says should be there. This is intelligence in its oldest, most literal sense, not the accumulation of the known, but the capacity to remain genuinely open to what the encounter contains. Marshall Rosenberg's giraffe ears are an instrument of interlegere. They read between the armored noun surface of every utterance, between the criticism, the judgment, the demand, and find what is actually alive beneath it. Language as wound technology, then, is language organized to produce legibility at the cost of intelligibility. The noun grammar of the ego system makes the environment manageable by making it readable, by converting the living encounter into a filed category. What is lost is not just a nuance. What is lost is the capacity for genuine encounter itself, the capacity to receive what is rather than imposing what should be. The wound, in making language legible, makes it systematically unintelligible, incapable of the interreading that alone produces genuine understanding. Enforcement. The written law as maximum noun. The descent reaches its furthest point in written law. Here, the noun achieves maximum durability and maximum separation from the living encounter that language originally expressed. Law is never written for the purpose of yesing anything. Law is written for the purpose of knowing. It exists to constrain, to prohibit, to divide the permissible from the impermissible, to support possession and ownership, which is acquisition to one party and denial to all others. The written law is the ego system's most durable technology because it does what no spoken word can do. It persists across time, independently of any living speaker. The tablet, the scroll, the code, the algorithm. Each is a mechanism for making the noun permanent, for preventing the verb from re-emerging. And there is a deep psychology in our collective relationship to the written word. We feel that when something is written, so must it be. This is the enfaithing we do in the practice of human law, the investment of reality-making power in the written form, such that the written word becomes a mechanism for manufacturing the binding force of a fact that it is not in any observable sense. The judge's sentence, "I sentence you to 10 years," does not describe a reality, it creates one, by fiat, from the position of an authority whose words are backed not by truth but by force. This is the world-making utterance, impressive speech at its most clarified, most nounified, most completely severed from the please that lies buried beneath it. What is the please beneath a judge's sentence? It is the community's desperate need for safety, for order, for the restoration of the we ground that the original harm disrupted. It is the pleas of a civilization that has been managing from the ecosystem for so long, through so many layers of accumulated noun grammar, that it can no longer find its way back to expressive speech. The law is the wound's attempt to reconstitute we through force, and this attempt is structurally guaranteed to fail, because genuine we cannot be enforced, it can only be disclosed. Notice what the law does etymologically. It gathers légère, fixes, and then uses that fixing as the basis for binding, légère. The two roots lege and liege, L-E-Y-G, are distinct in origin but converge in function at the law's apex. The written law is where gathering and fixing meets binding and constraining. It is the noun achieving its most complex expression, a picking out that becomes a tying down. The turn. Everything is still a please. Here's the essay's fulcrum. Every speech acts, however elaborated, however nounified, however impressive, however armored in institutional authority, is still at its deepest layer, please, or a thank you. This is Rosenberg's claim, and it is radical not because it is surprising, but because of what it requires of the listener. To hear the please beneath the impressive sentence, to receive even the most weaponized language as the wound's desperate expression of an unmet need, is not naivete. It is not the absence of discernment. It is the most demanding form of genuine encounter available. It requires that the listener operate from the is ground rather than from the ego system's reciprocal defensiveness. That the listener be, in the moment of reception, genuinely present to what is underneath the form, rather than merely reactive to the form itself. This is what the giraffe ears do. Not a trick, not a technique for managing difficult conversations, a capacity that arrives when the is ground is sufficiently operative. The capacity to interlégère, to read between the noun surface of every utterance, however armored, and find the creature in need that produced it. The alarm call beneath the aggression. The please beneath the no. The wound speaking in the only language the wound has learned. And this is precisely intelligence in its oldest sense, inter plus légère, to pick out between, to read what is actually present in the encounter rather than what the category says should be there. The giraffe ears are an instrument of genuine intelligence, not the accumulation of the known, but the capacity to remain in the between long enough for what is to surface through the noise of what should be. The recovery. speech from the is ground. Imagine the transition for a civilization or for a single person genuinely committed to it from speech as wound technology into speech as true expression. The first thing visible in this transition is a radical amplification of care. Care toward rendering what is more true and more precisely through and with language. Not the care of the impressive speaker who is careful about effect, the care of the genuine witness who is careful about accuracy, about faithfulness. The primary operation of this care is the recovery of the verb. The noun must be translated back into the process it froze. Chair becomes the chairing that is present here. Mind becomes minding. Self becomes selfing. This is not grammatical nicety, it is ontological correction. The noun claimed a fixity and a boundedness that the phenomena does not possess. The verb restores the phenomena to its actual nature, a process, an event, a movement in the field. And in restoring the verb, it dissolves the precondition for ownership, because you cannot own a verb, and you cannot impose what should be onto a process you have genuinely received as what is. The English word true roots in the Old English T-R-E-O-W-E, faithful. To speak truly is not to report facts accurately, it is to be faithful to what is. The etymology is the instruction. Stage 0 speech is faithful speech. It does not ask the phenomenon to be something other than what it is. It does not require the noun. It does not require enforcement. It does not require an audience prepared by the authority of the speaker. It asks only for genuine witness, persons in whom the is ground is sufficiently operative that what is faithfully offered can be faithfully received. To call another friend from the root that gives us freedom is to call them into their freedom, not to assign them a category. To say I am in full awareness that the I is a temporary organization of the inexhaustible field, not a permanent entity with boundaries that must be defended, is not a loss of self. It is the recovery of the self's actual nature. The personal pronoun used with this awareness an instrument of identity violence and becomes what it was always trying to be, a gesture of location within the shared field, not a claim of separation from it. Stage 0 speech does not eliminate the nuance and variety that Searle and Austin cataloged, it expands it. Assertion, direction, commitment, expression, declaration. All remain possible, and all can be performed from the is ground rather than from the ecosystem's management of appearance. The difference is not in the type of speech, but in its ground, whether it flows from genuine encounter or from the record's insistence. From the is ground, even a directive is expressive. Even a declaration can be an act of faithful witnessing rather than an imposition of what should be. True speech, faithful speech, is speech that can be observed as true by others. Not agreed with, necessarily. Genuine inquiry disagrees in full integrity, but seen, received by another consciousness as the faithful expression of what the speaker actually finds. This is the shared witnessing that all speech at its most honest is already searching for. The please that wants to be heard as please. The thank you that wants to be received as the celebration it is. Language is wound technology in the precise sense that the ecosystem Language is wound technology in the precise sense that the ecosystem, once installed by trauma, requires the noun grammar to function. The noun imposes what should be onto what is, which is Krishnamurti's definition of violence, now located at the level of grammar, prior to any physical enactment. Ownership is the noun extended into space. Written law is ownership made permanent. Physical force is ownership defending itself when what is refuses any longer to yield. The wound is present at every level of this sequence, not as malice, but as the organism managing from the known, seeking legibility, unable to interlegere. And yet, underneath all of it, always, is the please that wrote the first law, and the thank you that sang the first song. They have not gone anywhere. They are waiting in every word, in every demand, every prohibition, every armored declarative sentence to be heard. The goal is not to dismantle language. It is to hear through it, to restore in each act of genuine listening and genuine expression the capacity to receive what is actually being offered. This is what the giraffe ears do. This is what the circle does. This is what etymology does when practiced as contemplation rather than scholarship. It carries the word back toward the encounter it was built to name, and in doing so returns to the speaker the responsibility of meaning what they say. Only what is true can be understood. The noun that arrests the verb, the ownership that claims the river, the law that writes the no. None of these can ultimately be understood because none of them are true. They can be complied with, they can be enforced, they can be repeated until they feel like facts, but they cannot be integrated, solved, or received because they do not participate in what is. They have nowhere to land. Intelligence, interlegere, reading between, is the capacity to hear past the noun surfaces into the please and thank you that generated it. This is not a skill to be acquired. It is what the organism does when the known softens sufficiently to allow the genuine encounter. It is what the is ground makes possible when the ecosystem's insistence on legibility releases its grip. The word understand, to be stood under by truth, to allow truth to bear its weight on you, names the same capacity from the inside. You cannot understand what you are simultaneously imposing upon. The recovery of genuine speech begins precisely here, in the willingness to be stood under by what is, rather than standing over it with what should be. Never not here. The please and the thank you have never been stopped. They are what all speech, at every level of its elaboration, is still, even now, even in the most armored form, trying to say. Thank you.